As part of Health by Design's ongoing commitment to behavioral health education, we present another lesson in our Fundamentals of Weight Management series. Here's the Medical Director of Health by Design, Dr. David Player.
Hello. Welcome to lecture number 3 of this Fundamentals of Weight Management series. This is a lecture that I really enjoy giving because I've been doing it off and on since 1974 when I was a nephrology fellow, and learning to talk to people about salt and water and the effects of fluids on our body weight and of course the function of our kidneys and so forth. And I hope during this lecture again that you'll get the concept that scale weight, as we measure it when we go to the bathroom in the morning and hop on the scales, has very little to do with fatness and the reasons that you came to Health by Design to lose body fat or to gain lean tissue or something. If you'll remember from lecture number 1, we'll go back to this little drawing, and again remember I love to draw little men who look like tanks, and they're not meant to look like any of you guys or like me, although some of us tend to look more like this than we should. That in lecture number 1 we talked about the body as being compartmental, having lean tissue, which was your internal organs and your muscles and your bones, and fat tissue. And all of our efforts in this program using the right kind of nutrient are designed to get rid of excess fat tissue while we maintain the lean tissue. Now in today's lecture we're going to spend more time talking not about lean tissue and fat tissue, but I want you to get into a whole different concept of thinking about compartments, but we're going to talk about water and non-water, solids and liquids as a part of the body. And I like to start this lecture off by talking about one of my dialysis patients. I use him as an example because he's a big man who gains relatively large amounts of fluid weight during the days off dialysis. When I last saw him, he went home from dialysis weighing 250 pounds. And he had a nice weekend, and he came back for dialysis Tuesday morning, 3 days later, and he weighed 267 pounds. He had gained 17 pounds in 3 days. Can you imagine that, 17 pounds? Now you say to yourself, how can somebody gain 17 pounds? I've been working hard for 2 weeks and I've only lost 6 pounds. Here's a guy who can gain 17 pounds. Now the interesting thing was, of course, when he went home from dialysis, guess how much he weighed? You're right, he weighed 250 pounds again. He was down 17 pounds in 4 hours. With a dialysis machine, we were able to take his fluid space and reduce it by approximately 8 quarts of fluid. Now, if a person can gain and lose 17 pounds in a few hours or a few days, then the scale really tells us very little about what we came here to lose, which was fat, or very little about this solid phase in which fat and bone are in. And it's important for us then to understand the scales and how it relates to salt and water control in our body. Now, for purposes of this discussion, I want you to think of our little man again here, but not in terms of fat and lean, but in terms of solid and liquid, as I said. And to understand liquid movement and how liquid weighs in the body, one has to be able to know where the water is, and so forth. And when I'm talking about water here, I want you to know I'm not really talking about pure water. I'm talking about water with its dissolved salts. And so I'd like us to think of our body in a sense as being sort of a bag of salt water, and it has around 150 little pieces of salt per quart of water. You and I are not pure water, we are water with dissolved salts. And so for purposes of this discussion again, we are a big sack of salt water. Now it turns out that the water is in various compartments within our body. And the first compartment that I'd like to talk about is called intracellular water. It is water that is inside cells. And again, for purposes of this discussion, I'd like you to think that water that's inside cells, dissolved salt and water that's inside cells, is sort of off limits to the outside world, that we don't have water that moves freely from inside cells to outside. And so for purposes of this discussion, again, we're going to say that the water that's inside cells down here sort of remains inside the cells regardless of what we're doing outside. Now it turns out that of our bodies, generally around 60% of our body weight is water. And that about 60% of that is inside cells. that the other 40% then is not inside cells, it's outside the body, outside of cells, and we call it extracellular water. It's this portion from here to here. Now the extracellular water is divided into two parts, one of which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, and that's interstitial water. And interstitial water is water that is around cells. It's water that bathes the cells. It's in spaces in our body. It's water that's around your bowels, water that's around your heart, water that's around your lungs, lining your lungs. It's water that's in our mouth, saliva, water that's in our bladder, water that's in our bowel, water that we're getting ready to sweat. That's interstitial water, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that during this hour if we're going to understand how water affects weight in the body. The last compartment, and this little piece of the extracellular water, is this one here, which is called intravascular water. It's what makes us tick. It's the water that circulates around inside our blood vessels and gives us blood pressure and a pulse. Our heart beats and shoves that water around inside our blood vessels. Anybody know how much blood we have, how much fluid there is in our blood compartment? Well, it's about 5 liters, about 5 quarts in a full-grown adult, less in kids, more in great big people. And we're not going to talk a lot about that water, although fluid does move from that space into this space, and from this space into that space, so that there will be some net movement that we'll talk about in these two spaces. What I'd like you to think about here while we're drawing this man is that this interstitial water is sort of a tank. I'm going to draw this to look a little like a stomach, but it's not a stomach. And for the rest of this discussion, I'd like you to think of yourself as having a little tank within you that goes up and down in terms of its volume. And I'd like to think for just a minute of the things that happen to us in our environment that change the little tank, that change the fluids in our body. Now, when you and I got out of bed this morning, I assume we all got out of bed and staggered into the John, and we lost some fluid from our interstitial space. We lost some of this little tank. It went down. What? We urinated, and we lost some fluid. We didn't think about which tank it came from, but obviously it was fluid that yesterday was somewhere else in our body, and now it's gone. So the little tank shrunk. Let's think of some other ways that the little tank shrinks. Let's say that you go to Mexico and drink the water and have a bad bacterial reaction or something. What happens to you? Right, you get diarrhea. Now, diarrhea is a loss of water from the body. What do people die from when they have cholera? They die of dehydration. They die of loss of salt and water from the body. In fact, the way we treat cholera now, remember, is to plug IVs into a guy's arm and measure sort of what comes out the bottom and give him back that much fluid via big IVs, and the guy is then able to stay with a good blood pressure, and 4 or 5 days later gets up and goes home. The disease that's caused death in so many people is one of loss of fluids from the body. Let's think of another way that we lose fluids. You guys who were football players or have played tennis all afternoon on a hot afternoon, how much fluid can you lose? Anybody know? Well, I personally have lost as much as 10 or 12 pounds in double session football practices. And you say, well, where did that fluid come from? You know, when you finished your football practice, you were still able to walk out of there. Now, you were a little dizzier, your blood pressure was a little lower, your pulse was a little faster, but you weren't in shock. You were still able to go on home from football practice, and by the next day, when you came back to the next practice, your weight was right back where it was before. Now, that 10 or 12 pounds came out of this tank, and so instead of the tank being full, like it seeks to be, maybe it was down here. And some of the fluid came out of this intravascular space, and it made your blood pressure lower a little bit. It made your pulse a little faster. You wanted to go home and eat and drink, but you still felt okay. You weren't in shock. And that's how I want you to view the human body and the things that happen to it. Now you say, Doc, I came here to lose weight. What the heck are we talking about all this fluid stuff about? Well, if my dialysis patient can gain 17 pounds or lose 17 pounds in 3 or 4 hours, you need to understand that your body can gain 5 or 6 pounds of water and lose 5 or 6 pounds of water, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with this solid space up here, with this fat space that you and I came into this program to lose. Does everybody understand that? I think it's critical for you to know that a scales is a much better tool for a nephrologist than it is for somebody who's trying to lose weight on a diet program. Now, the reason this is important is that you and I, for the last several weeks, have been taking HMR products. Remember, we said one of the complications of taking very low-calorie diets that are very low in salt is that your kidneys didn't know you were going to do that, and you go on for several days losing lots of salt and water in your urine. And the net result of that, of course, is during the first few days of a diet program, any kind of a diet, but especially one like this where you're only eating 1 gram of salt, you put out lots of extra salt and water. And the little tank goes from here down to here. The net result is that yours and my blood pressure is a little lower, our pulse is a little faster, and the little tank is a little emptier, but we're still able to function in the world, and we've lost quite a lot of weight in many cases. Some of you big men may have lost already 10 or 12 pounds of salt and water. It's really this big bag of salt and water that's gone somewhere. You feel better, you feel a little less puffy. Some of you may feel a little bit dizzy already or have cramps in your legs, and we talked about how we would replace that with bouillon, and many of you are doing that, bouillon or dill pickles or something like that. Okay, so the object here is to understand that the little tank rises and falls with changes in what we do. Now remember, there's only 1 gram of sodium in 5 HMR or 5 or 6 HMR packages that you're taking per day. And for purposes of this discussion, I'd like you to think of you and me on a daily basis before you began HMR as eating around 9 grams of salt per day in our diet and the amount of water that comes and goes with it. Now you'll understand why I use 9 grams in just a minute. And it's not too far from truth in most of us. Most of us probably eat somewhere between 5 and 7 or 9 grams of salt per day. And some cultures eat 15 or 20 grams of salt per day, people who salt their food before they eat it. So let's pretend you were eating 9 grams before you came here, and then all of a sudden you begin HMR at 1 gram per day. Now your kidneys didn't know you were going to do that. And so the very first day you're on this diet, you are eating 1 gram, and how much is going to go out in your urine? Well, you're right. 9 grams are going to go on out in your urine. The net deficit for that day is what? 8 grams. Now it so happens that for each 4 grams of salt that you and I put out in our urine per day, we must excrete about 1 quart of water to go with it. If we don't do that, we'll spark, and we'll be unbelievably thirsty, or we'll be a lot waterlogged, or something will happen to us. And so when you and I put out 4 grams of salt in our urine, obviously we don't urinate little crystals of salt. We put out water with the salt. And we end up then losing fluid with that 4 grams. Now in the first day in your diet then, if you were eating 1 gram and putting out 9, you would lose 8 grams of salt, and the amount of fluid that goes with that is 2 quarts. Now it turns out that 2 quarts of fluid, each quart, 1 quart, let me put it up here, 1 quart of fluid of water equals 2.2 pounds. So you've got a guy who comes into a diet program, he loses 2 quarts of fluid, or 4.4 pounds the first day. None of it, or very little, came from this fat that he came to the diet program to lose. All of it came out of the little tank. Does everybody understand that? It's really, really important. Okay. Now the second day, if we did that for a long time, of course, the guy'd get into trouble, right? What would happen? His little tank would get so empty that he'd finally have no fluid left in his intravascular space, and he'd go into shock. Thank God that doesn't happen, because we have control mechanisms. What happens is the second day of the diet, the kidneys say, gee, you know, Jim's been on diets before. I doubt that he'll stick with it. I think we'll only put out 5 grams today, just as a hedge. And so the second day of the diet, the guy eats 1 gram of salt, he puts out 5 grams of salt. The net result is another quart of fluid is gone, 4 more grams of salt and the amount of water that was needed. And so we're now down another 2.2 pounds. 2 days of the diet and we're down 6.6 pounds already. We feel really good about it if we're on the scales. We sort of know in our mind it isn't real fat, but that doesn't make any difference anyway because you feel less puffy and so forth. Now you may be a little dizzy already, blood pressure may be a little lower, pulse may be a little faster, but you do feel better about it. 6.6 pounds gone. Fortunately, by the end of the first week or 10 days, you go into a new balance state that I'll describe for you over here, where you're eating 1 gram of salt and putting out 1 gram of salt. And thereafter, fluid shifts don't occur very much unless you and I change our intake. So if you're eating 1 gram, you'll put out 1 gram. The net result, however, after 10 days of a very low-calorie diet with low sodium is that the little tank is relatively empty, blood pressure is lower, pulse is faster, you may be a little more dizzy when you get out of a chair, but your weight may be down 10 or 12 pounds of fluid. I've seen some big men in this program lose as much as 20 pounds of fluid from their tank. Now there's some other sources. Sugar that's stored in muscles and in the liver, when it's released from the body and used, releases water with it. There's a lot of water bound up to glycogen and sugars that are stored in muscles. But the major source of loss in most people is this salt thing that we just talked about, salt and water that's lost. So it's important to understand that most of the weight loss in the first couple of weeks of such a program is not fat, but is fluids. And that's the reason that fast buck fat loss places, as I always call them, can tell you we guarantee 30 pounds of weight loss the first month. And if you remember the Mexican diet program, guys went down and bought diuretics to take for weight loss. Well, diuretics don't change fat loss at all. They change weight loss. They have nothing whatsoever to do with the fat that a person really needs to lose to get healthy. Now, you say, what happens then? We go out and we're in our 4th or 5th week of the program, and you've been doing tremendous, eating nothing but powder and milkshakes and soups and things like that. And you get out in your 4th week, and it's the time for your anniversary. And you've been doing the very best you can on essentially no food. And you decide you're going to go out with your husband, and you're going to make a good choice of some kind of food at the restaurant. And you think about it for a while, and you decide that somebody told you that chicken was a good food, and so you decide you'll have some chicken breast, and you'll have 4 ounces of chicken breast that after all is only 200 calories. 200 calories doesn't affect this fat very much at all. And you decide you'll have that 200-calorie piece of chicken and a little bit of salad and stuff, and that's all you'll have on your dinner. And of course that wouldn't affect fat very much, but you decide to have chicken a la Francisco, chicken a la something with some goop on it. And the goop tastes really good and makes the chicken taste better. It's something kind of salty and something maybe a little oily, but probably not, just something salty, and you know it's not too bad for you. And so let's pretend, just for the sake of this lecture, that the salt content of that chicken a la Francisco was 9 grams. That probably isn't going to be that high, but maybe you salted your salad a little bit too. Okay, so you have 9 grams of salt on this plate. Your kidneys are used to your eating 1 gram of salt per day, and they put out 1 gram of salt per day, and now tonight you're going to eat 9 grams of salt. What's going to happen? Well, you're going to that day eat 1 gram of salt. You're going to eat 9 grams of salt, and how much are you going to put out? 1 gram of salt. Net result? 8 grams of salt accumulated in the body. Now, to keep us from sparking, we must hold on to the amount of fluid necessary to go with that salt, which, as I said, is 1 quart for every 4 grams. The net result of eating chicken Francisco as we come off of a very low-calorie diet with low salt is that the guy in one night can gain 2 quarts, 4.4 pounds. And if he does that again the next day, he could be up to 6.6 pounds. And you and I, when we go to the scales the next day, knowing that we ate something that was very low in calories, and we get on it and we say, oh man, I've gained 6.6 pounds already. This is kind of a lousy diet. And this is something that you have to understand intellectually in your head, that what you have gained has nothing to do with fatness, has little to do with leanness. It is only an issue of salt and water gain. The little tank, which wanted to be back up here anyway, has refilled and is back to its full level. And the interesting thing about that is that that salt and water gain that you have with one meal like that even can last for 4 or 5 days. It's just an amazing thing how it can go on for 4 or 5 days. It's like the body is just dying to get that extra salt and water back in it. And it can reaccumulate fluid very rapidly, and then it can hold on to it for as long as a week after that. So you need to understand this phenomenon, and it's a normal, natural thing. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the fatness that you came here to lose or to gain. Okay, now it's important then to go on to a discussion of how these compartments are controlled and what allows your kidneys to do this. A lot of my coworkers say, well, Player, you shouldn't talk about kidneys and how they work. That's kind of nephrology stuff. But for the rest of this lecture, which is very, very important to women, I think, for women to understand what happens with hormonal cycles and menstrual cycles and so forth, I think you kind of need to understand how the kidneys work. Now, I have up here a drawing of the basic unit of a kidney, which is called a nephron. Now, you probably can't see it real well, but let me kind of describe to you how a nephron works. If you could pretend that you have a balloon here in your hand, and that your fingers are arteries bringing blood into the kidneys, and pretend that your fingers are sticking into this balloon, And now you've got balloon wrapped around your fingers, and there's a space in here. Everybody kind of understand that? Now the space, the balloon lines the fingers and has pores in the balloon. It's a filter membrane, if you will. And the pores are just the right size so that the blood cells and the big proteins in the blood can't get through the holes in the membrane, can't get through the pores. But the water of the blood and its dissolved salt, this bag of salt water, filters through into this space. And it is basically the beginning of urine that forms in the space, and it comes from the plasma part of the water. And the big proteins and the big blood cells turn around and go back to the heart. Everybody kind of with me there? Okay, now let's transfer that over to here. Here we have blood coming in an artery into the kidney, and here's this big ring of capillaries and so forth, and here's blood cells going back to the heart. And right in here we have the cup where urine is being formed. Now the water of the urine, what eventually becomes urine, comes filtering along this little tubule, comes down this loop, this tubule, comes back up here, and comes out. And believe it or not, in one day, a human being filters at this point in the cup, right here, filters about 120 quarts per day. Now, if you and I put out 120 quarts of anything in our urine, we'd be in big trouble. We'd be in shock. Our little tank would get depleted very quickly. And obviously that does not happen. If it did, we'd die. We'd go into shock. But what happens is that this fluid, as it comes down this tubule, by the time it gets to about here, about 90% of the fluid has been reabsorbed back into little blood vessels that are kind of coming along here on each side of this tubule. So the salt and the water goes back into the blood, and what stays inside the tubule is metabolic breakdown products, urea and protein waste products that are designed to get on out here in the urine eventually. So 90% is reabsorbed there, but 90% of 120 still leaves you with about 12 quarts of urine that would still be formed. You and I'd still be in big trouble if we were putting out 12 quarts of anything per day. Now what happens, this goes on over, and by the time it gets over to about here, another 9% has been reabsorbed, so that we only put out about 1% of that filtered fluid over here in our collection space. So, and 1% of 120 is around 1,200 cc's of urine per day. And we all make somewhere between 1 and 2 quarts of urine per day, depending on how much we're eating and drinking. Now, when you and I go on a very low salt diet, like HMR, the very first week, as we said before, you take in 1 gram of sodium and put out 9 grams of sodium, and then 5 and 3, and finally come back into balance. 1 gram in, 1 gram out. And the way that happens is that the kidney, in this part of it, after a few days says to itself, gee, Minnie, this guy's diet is for real. He's really going to be on a low-salt diet for a long time. I better do some compensating. And so this part of the kidney tubule starts reabsorbing, say, 95% of all the fluid by the time it gets down to here. And it gets really avid for reabsorbing salt and water, so less gets delivered over here to make urine. Everybody understand how that comes into balance? Okay, now the little tank gets depleted, the guy goes back into balance, 1 gram of salt in, 1 gram of salt out, and he gets out, say, 3 or 4 weeks and goes for the anniversary dinner, and what happens? Well, now here's this big load of new salt coming in to this part of the tubule that's already hungry for salt. And the guy just sucks up that salt and water like crazy and gains 4 or 6 or 8 pounds related to the salt that was in his diet. Comes into a new balanced state finally and may hold on to, as I said, maybe 2, 3, 4 quarts of water over the next week, and then slowly lose it again if he goes back on the 1 gram sodium diet that he was on before. Hope everyone understands that. It's a little bit of a difficult concept. So the kidney tubules change to make an adjustment for the amount of salt that you and I are taking in. Now, I told you this was an important lecture for women. And the reason it is because this portion of the kidney tubule over here, from about here down to here, is under the influence of a hormone called aldosterone. Anybody ever heard of that one? Aldosterone? Aldosterone, or aldosterone, is made in the adrenal glands, which are little glands right over the top of the kidneys, little fatty-looking glands. And aldosterone causes salt to be reabsorbed, kind of like what happens over here. The salt gets reabsorbed back into the blood under the influence of this hormone, aldosterone. Now, aldosterone is a steroid hormone, and steroids, let me draw you a steroid. You may have forgotten your biochemistry here, but a steroid substance sort of has this biochemical formula. We'll draw it right in here. Don't have a lot of room. I'm sorry, right there, and here, here. Now, each one of these corners is a carbon atom, and what the differences in different kinds of steroids that are in yours and my body, of which there are 4 or 5 different kinds of things that we call steroids. The differences are whether they have a double bond here, or a hydroxyl here, or a double bond here, or some other kind of a side chain. Those things, and you and me, determine whether we're sopranos or whether we're basses, whether we're women or whether we're men, whether we make prednisone or whether we make some other things. Now, it turns out that aldosterone is a steroid hormone that causes us to reabsorb salt and water back out of this tubule into the blood. And women make 2 interesting hormones. You both know, all of you know what they are. They are progesterone and estrogen. And you make them cyclically from the time you're 10 or 12-year-old girls. You make them cyclically every month. And they rise and fall. Remember, right before you have a period, your estrogen levels and your progesterone levels rise to their highest point. Well, it turns out that the kidney tubule here, which reabsorbs salt and water under the influence of this hormone, sometimes can't tell the difference between aldosterone and progesterone and estrogen. Can't tell the difference. And the net result is that right before your period, during that period right before your period, sometimes during your period, and for a day or 2 afterward, you hold on to salt and water like crazy. And in a room like this with this size class, there is a variety of volume gains in women. But I'd say the average girl maybe gains 2 or 3 pounds of fluid. Maybe different ones of you may be different here. But I have known women that gained as much as 6 or 7 pounds right before their period or during their period. And it all happens because the kidney tubule gets confused. It confuses aldosterone with progesterone and estrogen and makes you puff up. And women in and around the time of their period, guys, are puffed up. They are swollen. But anyway, it's important to understand what happens because the net result is that a woman who's on a diet, losing not very much from this fat space, may have a tremendous gain in fluid at that time. And let me describe a typical kind of thing. A person is on an HMR diet, 500-600 calories a day, eating nothing but powdered milkshakes. And she's losing 2.3 pounds per week. And she loses 2.3, 2.3, 2.3, and in the next week she has her period and she gains 2 pounds. She says to herself, gee, Minnie, you know, I'm eating nothing and I've gained 2 pounds. Now, what she really did that week, of course, was she lost the same 2.3 pounds of fat that she'd been losing all along. But this progesterone, aldosterone thing made her hold on to 4 or 5 pounds of fluid. Net result, she looks at the scale, she says, shoot, it's a lousy diet. Screw it, I think I'll go eat. And so she does. Now, what typically happens is she goes out and pigs out and feels better about it. And there are reasons why she's hungry anyway because of her period. And we'll get into that in another lecture in the applications series. But she's hungry and she eats and she feels a lot better. And she eats for a couple of days. She may puff up just a little bit more. And then she finishes her period. She spends 2 or 3 days on the toilet getting rid of all that salt and water. And at the end of the next week, after pigging out for a week, she goes and gets on the scale. She's down 2 or 3 pounds and says to herself, well, gee, it really doesn't make any difference whether I eat or not. Maybe my body is changing. I think maybe I'll wing it this month on my diet. And so she wings it, and a month later, she's up 10 pounds. Everybody understand how that happens? And I think that single event is the major cause of failed diets in America. Women don't burn as many calories as men anyway, and then you throw in this problem of salt and water gains, which are occurring much faster than gains and losses from the solid place up here. Remember, fat is lost very, very slowly. As we know, the maximum a woman can lose on even a 500-calorie diet is about 2.5 pounds of fat per week. Well, here we're talking about a fluid gain that can be as much as 5 pounds in a day. How discouraging. And I think that's why diets fail in so many women in America. Hope everybody understands that, because the salt and water gains and losses have nothing to do with fat at all. But again, the charlatan clinics, as I call them, have been able to make millions of dollars by giving people diuretics and stuff that makes them lose salt and water. It has nothing to do with fat at all. Now that gets us off into another discussion for a few minutes of drugs that affect fluids in the body. And I might go back, if a person's on a good diet, like a Weight Watchers diet, which is what, maybe 1,200 calories a day or 1,000 calories a day. Remember, on a 1,000 calorie a day diet, if a woman is somebody who burns 1,400 calories a day and she's eating 1,000 a day, that's a 400 calorie per day deficit. Every 9 days, she's going to lose 1 pound of fat, maybe 3 pounds in a month, eating sprouts and cardboard, or at least eating not very much, as I say. And she gets to the end of the month and gains 4 or 5 pounds of fluid and has lost 3 pounds of fat, and she says, I can't do this diet anymore. This is crazy. I can't live my whole life like this. And then she goes and pigs out and her diet is over. It's a very important thing to understand that your weight any 1 week here, or even any 2 weeks here, may have little to do with how much fat you're losing. And it gets back again to that important concept of body composition, of being able finally to measure with impedance tools or underwater weights or skin calipers how much we are really losing, what is our real body composition. Now I want to talk just a little bit about diuretics. Diuretics are interesting medicines. They came out of sulfa research at the time of the war. Somebody was taking care of some dog in the back room and giving him sulfa for his sore throat, and lo and behold, the dog just urinated all day long. And somebody said, what a great medicine. That's really neat stuff. We can use it to treat heart failure or kidney failure or all these sicknesses where people hold on to excessive fluids. And diuretics have been really wonderful for that. And I, as a nephrologist, I use lots of diuretics for people who have kidney failure or who are almost in kidney failure and need to get rid of excess fluids from their body. And it can buy us a lot of time sometimes before we begin dialysis. Now, diuretics, as it turns out, are abused, however, in diet programs and by people who feel like they're puffy and so forth. And the way diuretics work, interestingly, the most common types of diuretics are what we call thiazides, and they've been used for years as a first-line therapy for high blood pressure. Because remember, when you give them for high blood pressure, they make you lose little bits of fluid from the tank, a little bit of fluid from this space, and your blood pressure drops. Now, it does that with some side effects that I'll talk about in a minute. But the way diuretics work, particularly one called Lasix that we now use, which is a potent one, beginning from down here all the way up to somewhere in here, diuretic poisons this tubule so that the salt and water that was going to go here back into the blood doesn't. It gets blocked. And the net result is that fluid that was going to end up being absorbed back into the blood goes rolling right on out. And the first day you're on a diuretic, you may eat, 9 grams of salt and you'll put out 18 grams of salt. Everybody understand that? You may put out 18 and take in 9, result being that your little tank gets depleted, your blood pressure is a little lower, your pulse is a little faster, and so forth. Just like starting a very low-calorie diet on a 1-gram salt diet. Now, let's go out several weeks. And remember what happens, of course, when this part of the tubule gets messed up and gets poisoned by the diuretic. This part of the tubule over here eventually says, gee, I better start reabsorbing some extra fluid or this guy will go into shock. And so this part of the tubule gets all revved up, absorbing salt and water. And this part of the tubule over here, of course, is poisoned by the diuretic. The net result is a person on a diuretic comes into a new balance phase. Now, when he stops taking the diuretic, for whatever reason, this part of the tubule is all revved up. It didn't know he was going to stop the diuretic, and this part's no longer poisoned, and so all the salt in the water gets reabsorbed back into the body. And people who come off diuretics often puff up like crazy. The little tank, instead of filling up, actually bulges like this. And people feel really puffy for a few days coming off diuretics. So if you're somebody who has taken a diuretic for high blood pressure or for menstrual volume retention or something like that, understand how diuretics work. They poison the kidney tubule and they cause a host of other side effects. They make your potassium drop, which can cause irregular heartbeats and muscle weakness. They make your magnesium drop, which can cause the same thing. They make your uric acid go up, which can cause gout. They make your blood sugar control less good. They make your cholesterol and your triglycerides go higher. They cause a whole host of changes. Higher calcium, more risk of various things. It's a very interesting thing. Diuretics have been very good for us in medicine, but we have to understand all the side effects that they cause. And certainly in people who start a very low-calorie diet like this, most people stop their diuretics before they begin a 1-gram sodium diet. Now, the last group of agents that I wanted to talk about in this lecture is a group that we call non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs are drugs that the prototype was aspirin and butazolidine and Indocin. And more recently we have Talectin and Naproxen and Clinaril and Advil and Motrin and Feldene, and there's a whole host of them. These are agents which are used by elderly people for decreasing joint pain. They're also used by young women to decrease menstrual cramping. And we'll get into what that can cause in terms of fluid retention. Now it's very interesting. These are good drugs that have added and have helped ease a lot of suffering in some people, but they have a variety of side effects that you need to know about. And the one that's most important to this lecture is that they decrease blood flow, or most of them do, decrease blood flow coming into the kidneys, and the net result is that this part of the tubule reabsorbs more salt and water, and people who begin taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs usually hold on to a pound or two of fluid extra. Their blood pressure may rise by 5 millimeters or 10 millimeters, and they may feel just a little puffy for a few days when they're taking that non-steroidal drug. Now if you need it, you take it, but you have to understand what it does to your weight. Because if you're on a Weight Watchers program where you're only losing 100 calories a day, and it takes 3,500 calories to lose a pound, then you could lose 1 pound in a month on your diet and gain 2 pounds of fluid from the Advil or the Motrin. And you throw the Advil and Motrin on top of the woman's volume gain from her progesterone and her estrogen, and you could have a woman who gains 5, 6, 7 pounds in and around the time of her period. It may help her menstrual cramps, but makes her be even more puffy than she was before. I hope everybody understands that. And it's not that we shouldn't take these agents. You need to be aware, though, of their side effects. And one of them is this fluid retention side effect, and the second one is a problem in many, especially my dialysis patient, a problem of causing gastric irritation, a risk of ulcers, and a risk of bleeding, and so forth. So almost every kind of chemical you and I take can have a side effect, and diuretics and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like Motrin and Advil can have big changes on body fluid and body volume. Well, I think those are the most important things I wanted to say in this particular lecture. The thing I want you to remember most is that the scales on a given day doesn't tell you very much about your composition. It doesn't tell you very much about how much bone you have, how much fat you have, or how much muscle you have. It certainly doesn't tell you how much fluid you have. If my dialysis patient, a big man, can gain 17 pounds in one day and lose 17 pounds in 4 hours, and walk in and walk out and apparently not be very, very different, then you and I need to understand that scale weight changes from week to week are relatively unimportant. And don't hang your hat on the scale weight. The fact is that every week you're here, you'll lose the same amount of fat if you eat the same thing and if you exercise the same amount. You women can lose maybe 2.3 to 2.6 pounds of fat per week, and that'll go on forever, the whole time you're here. The scales may not say that. You may have a week where you lose 1 pound or even gain a pound, but the next week after that or in the 2 weeks after that you'll lose another 5 or 6 or 7 pounds, and you'll see that it all comes out in the wash. It all comes out on an average. So I want you please, please to be totally aware of this issue of fluid gains and fluid losses. If there are any questions on this stuff, I want you to come up and we'll talk about it more, and I'll be talking over and over about your little tank emptying and filling, because it's a good explanation for why weight losses occur at a different rate. Fat loss occurs like this, constant. Weight on a daily basis and a weekly basis is doing this on the curve. Thank you very much. This is the end of lecture number 3.